Our speaker today on What's Up Wednesday is Managing Director of Wind Reach Consulting Services, an Ottawa-based firm that specializes in risk management, governance, and internal audits. She was Interim Chief Risk Officer at the Bank of Canada. Carmen is regularly called upon to advise complex government departments and central agencies, crown corporations, and not-for-profit organizations on their risk management arrangements, including those around major transformations. It's a real pleasure to have her here. She's also experienced corporate director and brings a perspective of the risk practitioner as well from a board of directors position. And I know that's relevant to a lot of our CMC members. It's how to manage risk and what are the risk oversights. She's going to bring us up to date on this. Welcome, Carmen Abela. Hi.
Hi, and thank you very much, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Thanks for that very kind introduction, Craig. Before we get started, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we're located on today across the country and I suppose internationally. I am delivering today's session from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And would encourage you all to take a moment to think about the land that you're on and acknowledge it with gratitude. This gratitude is particularly important as it is for those of you that are in Canada, that it is National Indigenous History Awareness Month, which calls really upon all of us in Canada, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to honor the history and the heritage of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And of course, this is particularly important given the recent events that we've seen, not only in Kamloops, but elsewhere, that really underscores the importance of reconciliation and Indigenous rights. So I would encourage you to take a moment and reflect upon the land that you are on and offer gratitude for that. I would like to, and I'm going to ask perhaps Craig to go to the first slide, just by way of introduction, perhaps a little bit of an elaboration on my bio. I will be talking to you today about the basics of risk management, focusing on a little bit of demystification of some of the basic principles of risk, so that you can utilize that in the context of your client engagements and better support your clients. I think of myself as a bit of a pain manager. I think most consultants would agree. So we want to sort of talk a little bit about the client's realities. What are the pain? What are the opportunities that they're facing? And therefore, then how can risk management in its various forms help to facilitate that pain management, to help to address and add value in that context? And I'll walk you through a few elements of those options. I will say from the start, my practice is based out of Ottawa, is largely public sector in its focus. I work with mostly federal, but also in some cases provincial and crown corporations, and I'm on the board of a crown and also some not-for-profit organizations. So most of my stories, I teach by storytelling largely. Most of my stories will be heavily oriented towards those sorts of sectors, but very happy to elaborate on those. And I think most of my lessons today will be more broadly applicable as well. So perhaps, Craig, we could go on. We're going to start, as we try to with these virtual sessions, keep them as interactive as possible. We're going to start with a quick poll, just to help me calibrate the sort of the level of experience amongst all of you. If you could please sort of just describe your level of experience in supporting clients in the area of risk management. First option is no experience at all. This is brand new to you. Some experience or considerable experience, which would be fairly mature practice that you might have. So if you can give us an answer and just press submit, and as we wait for those results to come in, I will again elaborate a little bit on my experience. So I've been in this space for about 25 years in different formats. So I would be in the considerable experience realm. And I see we've got a split about 50% in the middle and just over 30% in the expertise space, which is great. So we'll calibrate it to that. But I will, for the few that are in the no experience at all, welcome to the practice of risk management. It is a really, really interesting and very dynamic practice, and we'll bring you along and hopefully whet your appetite for more work in this space. So let's get started with the foundations. So I always start here because while we all might think about risk on a regular basis, in fact, we practice risk management every day when we cross the street or when we drive our cars. I do like to lay the foundation because there is different interpretations, and it's important to have a common base. When we speak about a risk, so what is a risk? A risk is an event or a circumstance that incubates or stems from the organization's conditions, business conditions, that if it occurred, could have an effect on the achievement of objectives. Notice I don't say a negative effect or a positive effect. It could have an effect generally. Standards like the ISO 31000 model speak about risk in a neutral fashion, positive and negative. I will admit, I think about risk as things that can go wrong. I think it's frankly mostly what clients are worried about is how do we get ahead of the issues that could hurt us. But that's an important thing. What I want to underscore with the definition of risk is that it is not an issue. It is not something an organization is living with now. It is a potential event. It is something in the future. And that's important because we want to think about risk management as a proactive exercise that helps prepare an organization for certain eventualities. You've got issues management in an organization that will help with the day-to-day management of operational issues. That's somewhat different. And I would also encourage you to think about risk. Although impact is a dimension of risk, a risk is not a consequence. A risk is not, I often hear clients say, well, when I ask them what the risks are, they will often say, well, there's a risk that I won't achieve my objectives. Well, that's absolutely, quite frankly, a useless definition of risk, because there are a lot of events or circumstances that could occur that could lead to that impact or that consequence. So we want to understand risk as much as we can as a root cause event that has not yet occurred but could occur. So number one, lay that foundation down. The second obvious thing we have to sort of unpack is what we mean by risk management. And the general, and you'll find the theoretical or the textbook definitions in ISO or other bodies of knowledge. This is my kind of layman definition. It is a set of management practices fundamentally. Very importantly, management practices that are enabled by the organizational culture. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Ultimately, those practices work together to, again, there's that word proactively assess, manage, and respond to risk in a manner that is commensurate or in balance with the profile of the organization's risk and the appetite of either senior management or the board, depending on the organization. What do I mean by all of that? So you've got a bunch of practices, which we'll talk about today, that help you to understand where your risks exist, how you respond to them, how you communicate them, and so on. The point about making sure that the risk management practices are commensurate with the risk profile is really important. An organization that is highly complex, that is highly technical, perhaps digital, will need a certain type of maturity, a certain type of sophistication of the risk management activities than would a company like mine, which is knowledge-based, smaller in nature, no bricks and mortar, and so on. So we want to make sure that as we're advising our clients on risk management, that we're not, as I like to say, you're not killing a mosquito with a sledgehammer. You're building a risk management practice in a way that responds effectively to the nature of your organization, the nature of the complexity of the organization, and the risks that you're exposed to. You'll see that bullet there that says risk management is just good management. That is true. It is not, though, an excuse to not do systematic, regular risk management. I often get pushback from clients to say that we do this every day in our business. We don't need anything more than regular kind of day-to-day operations. That is, we don't want to make, as you'll see, I'll talk a little bit about oversight burden. We do have to be conscious of that, but it is what we try to do is embed risk management in the day-to-day management practices so that the management practices are made more robust while still achieving those goals of risk. And then I'm using the term risk-based solutions, and I'll talk about that as well. This is, a walkthrough. There's various different types of solutions that we as consultants have to offer or should be offering our clients, basically to solve problems. A risk assessment is the basic one where you're doing kind of a heat map of risks and analysis. But there are many other tools that we can and should use to support decision-making, oversight, and achievement of business objectives. And I'll walk you through 3 examples today. So those are some foundations. Craig, if we can go to the next slide. This diagram is just a quick illustration of a point that I sort of alluded to a minute ago. Typically, when we think about risk management, people automatically go to the framework, the roles, responsibilities, the methodology for how you identify a risk, how you assess it, and so on. And that is key, as are the tools and the methods. But those things, what I want you to think about when we think about risk management is really thinking of it as a system of control, a system of risk practices that work together and in an ideal world are mutually supportive. And what's really key that I would underscore in this diagram as well are the 2 things: the information, which is really the lifeblood of risk management. You can have a beautiful framework and sophisticated tools that are completely compliant with the standards that say ISO uses, which is the de facto standard. But if the information is not flowing, people are afraid to share, or the data doesn't even exist. And if the culture is one that is not supportive or encouraging of fearless information sharing, fearless risk disclosure and discussion, then all of those methods and processes and tools will be wasted. They'll sit on your shelf and they won't work. So this is really I encourage you to think about this as a systemic exercise. It doesn't need to be too complex, again, depending on the nature of the organization, but those cultural and those information forces are super key to having effective risk management in place in an organization. So we'll change the slide, please. So I talked about at the beginning, I think of myself as a pain manager, so a problem solver, if you will, as I'm sure all of you do as well. So, we'll talk about custom-built solutions, and I think what we wanted, and I would always encourage you, if you're selling or helping a client to develop a risk management function or just simply implementing a risk assessment, for instance, that I would really encourage you to focus first on the client realities, because that is the source of the problem and therefore the source of the solution. What I'm seeing in terms of my clients, and again, as I say, largely government and not-for-profit, and largely federal government at that, are these factors, and there are more, but these are the biggies. We are seeing, it states the obvious, I know, an unprecedented pace of change. It's not even increasing, it's increasing and it's accelerating. So whether that be technological change, cultural change, client expectations, it's just a huge factor, and it is a source. If you think about it as a source of risk, it is the #1 source of risk in my practice these days. Similarly, I would say the clients that I deal with are dealing with issues that are entirely interconnected. I cannot think of an issue amongst my client base that is not somehow bumping into or integrated with other complex factors. Nothing exists on it as an island. And so we need to bear in mind the interconnectivity, again, a real risk factor, but at the same time offering a very interesting opportunity for interconnected solutions and benefits, a single benefit for a single investment. The downside, of course, is that it leads to, if there is a big risk that materializes, that there is a high degree that there will be compounding effects, and we need to understand those. Interestingly enough, and again, I'm sure this is beyond the government, in the government context, but we are seeing all at the same time concurrent demands for greater oversight, due to different expectations, whether they be from compliance, different public sector, public expectations, stakeholder expectations for certain behaviors and certain commitments. So all of this, as the increase demand, or as the demand for oversight increases, there is equally, and in opposition, high pressure to minimize burden in terms of oversight. So there's this really challenging, compelling force on the part of management and boards in particular for that. If you're going to oversee, let's do it as efficiently as possible. And again, I would park that, because that's going to be a real part of the value proposition for risk management. We also see, and I think this is a factor that affects, it actually is a challenge for risk management, frankly, a real prevalence for what I would call short-termism. So in business strategy, and again, this is not in all cases, because there are great exceptions to this rule, but we see a lot of, perhaps because of the pressure that organizations are under, a lot of pressure to react. And that takes us into kind of looking at the end of our noses instead of the long-term horizon. Again, because sometimes you simply have to do that, but it does make it a little bit harder to have that long-term proactive horizon in terms of what we want from a risk management regime. And then finally, and again, I would have said a few years ago that this was a factor that was primarily in government, but I think these days in the context of the Me Too movement, of Black Lives Matter, of various issues around anti-racism, ESG and EDI, where organizations are increasingly living in fishbowls. So everything we are doing in our organizations, everything our clients are doing is subject to scrutiny, especially in the context of social media. So these are factors that are all extremely relevant. Some of these factors, as we'll talk about shortly, are real enablers for risk management and really underscore the value of implementing good risk management. In other cases, there are real factors why people will either be unwilling or unable to assess risk. So for instance, the fishbowl moment, the fishbowl factor, for instance, might create a disincentive for people to be open and disclose fearlessly their risk information, for fear that will get out, for fear that somehow, and I've seen this in the government way back when we first started risk management about in the federal system about 20 years ago, a reluctance to even say the word risk, that if you somehow said you had risk, you were somehow failing. In fact, it's the opposite, right? We want to have brave leadership, good oversight of these risks so that we can get ahead of them. So I'll leave it at that. There are many factors. I'll come back to some of these factors as we go through the discussion. But these are factors that are really kind of important. Just very quickly, I'll go through what I would consider the value proposition in the context of those factors or the client realities. What we know for sure, and we've seen it and documented it, that if you have a good risk management regime in place, it quite simply just allows the organization to get ahead of the risks that could undermine its objectives. That is the most fundamental value prop of such a regime. It does, if it's done well at the enterprise level, it does allow for collaboration, systematic information sharing that really drives solutions to systemic problems. Key to that is the ability to break down silos and have a common lexicon and a common kind of process that brings people together. And ultimately that also greatly, speaking as a board member, greatly increases not only the quality of decision-making that operational managers or even strategic CEO kind of deputy minister level folks make, but also as a member of a board, you have more information on what you need to get ahead of, and therefore your oversight of the organization is that much better. Which, at least in theory, and I haven't seen any studies on this, confidence of stakeholders and organizational trust increases. Again, if you can get past the fear of talking about risk, and I think most organizations have gotten there, it does show good due diligence and therefore increases that confidence. Said another way, if we quickly go to the next slide, said another way, we're really talking about, as I said, getting ahead of the risks that can undermine success of the client. informing decisions and sharing risk information so that collectively the system of management, the system of oversight can manage and oversee things better. So there's 3 value propositions here that I'm going to spend the rest of the discussion kind of walking you through. And this is working at the speed of light, but 3 options or 3 risk-based solutions that will help to achieve each of those 3. We'll hit the high notes, probably 50,000 feet, but hopefully whet your appetite and leave room for discussion at the end of this session. So let's jump into that. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk to you about 3 things. Some of you who are on the more mature scale of experience will be familiar with some of this. Risk assessment, I'll do a quick touch on that. It's basic kind of entry-level risk management. We'll talk a little bit about how you can do risk-based prioritization for your clients, so making tough choices around using risk as an input. And then I'm going to put my board hat on and talk about how you do risk-informed, or how you can support risk-informed oversight through assurance mapping. So let's jump into that. The first piece I want to talk about is really just, as I said, a basic discussion on risk assessment that can be done at a whole bunch of different levels. Risk assessment it's not rocket science. It's basically looking at an objective or a set of objectives, whether that be an enterprise, could be a vision and a mission of a whole corporation. It could be a program objective. It could be a transformative project, and really understanding what that objective is, and then unpacking all of the risks that could get in the way of achieving that objective in a systematic and proactive fashion. So depending on the level you're doing it at, you typically would tie that in an ideal world to your environmental scan or other planning processes. So if you're doing, let's say it's an enterprise-wide risk profile or risk assessment, it's a natural complement to the environmental scan of an organization, where you're unpacking and trying to understand the business conditions that are happening now and those that are emerging. A nice off-ramp from an environmental scan is then, of course, to say, okay, given that, what could go wrong? What are the risks we need to proactively prepare for and perhaps even avoid? So it is a fairly structured analysis. You would typically assess risk, and I'm sure a number of you have seen this, in terms of the likelihood and the impact of each risk event. So you might identify, let's say if it's an enterprise risk assessment, you would say identify 10 key risks that could undermine the success of the strategic plan. And that should be built into the strategic plan. You would identify 10 and you would rank those quite simply. Likelihood of each one occurring over the period of the plan, say 3 years, and the severity of the impact that could occur if you had it. And I didn't include a heat map. I felt it was sort of basic, but you know, the red, yellow, green kind of squared diagram. And all that, what that allows you to do is to identify the top priorities that management should be, and the board, if you're doing it for the board, should be seized by. There will be some that are in the green zone, some that are in the yellow that may be, okay, it's good to know they're there, that's on our radar, but we don't need to worry about them. But man, do we have the top 3 that we really want to focus on, and the strategies around that you put in place around those top risks basically are resource consumptive activities, and therefore they get integrated into the plan and resourced and implemented accordingly. So that's why the link to planning in this case is so critical. Allows you to determine and to show that you are doing good due diligence over your risk, so you're taking it, so your clients are taking it seriously, and then of course, again, putting my board hat on really gives confidence to the governing bodies of the organization that you are taking this seriously, and including defending any decision not to manage a risk. So as a board member, I am not entirely bothered about people taking risk if I know that they've even thought about them in the first place. So as long as they can show me as a member of an audit committee or a board or a risk committee that they've thought it through and they have a process as to why they've identified this is something that they can accept, then I'm comfortable. If I know that they haven't done that assessment, then I'm a little bit more worried. So that's the risk assessment. And again, this is a sort of speed of light survey overview. So if there's any questions on this, we can get to it in the Q&A period, and maybe I'll jump into the next discussion. This one is the next sort of risk-based solution is really making tough decisions using structured processes that embed risk. So it's not always just risk-based prioritization, but it's really trying to set priorities as based on risks. And essentially the processes, kind of the management processes, kind of look like this. You will have seen, some of you perhaps that would be involved in resource allocation is a really easy example. So investment planning, let's take IT projects or real property projects, or even regulators where they're trying to figure out where to place scarce resources. A big source of this methodology comes from the internal audit field as well, where you've got, I don't know if there's any internal auditors in the room, but in the room on the system, but there there is a multi-year internal audit plan that good internal audit shops have to develop, and there's only so many resources that can go around. So what we try to do is basically you start with a universe of activities, whether they're audit projects, possible investment proposals, regulatory compliance activities, whatever the universe is, it's a set of things that could be looked at or funded. And all we're doing in this case is saying, okay, let's risk rank this universe. Let's prioritize this list of 100 activities to determine what are the most important top 10 activities that we need to do. The examples I use when I'm doing risk-based planning or risk-based prioritization, the factors, the criteria that I use to prioritize are listed there in that left-hand box. Risk is one for sure. So I'm interested in, if I'm doing an internal audit plan, in spending time where the areas of risk are greatest. But I'm also interested in knowing which areas are most important to the organization. And because I'm in the public sector space, I'm very also interested in what the public or the stakeholder needs are. So I have tools that allow me to risk rank or to prioritize a set of activities, a set of plans, using these factors that then drive out my top 10 activities, and then essentially, to move to the right-hand side of the screen, allow me to make tough decisions, allow my clients to make tough decisions as to where to spend scarce resources. It also allows, as I said, again, for transparency. So you can, the client increasingly, especially in my world, in the public sector, the calls for transparency are ever present. So you are able to say transparently, this is why we're looking at something, this is why we're not. And as I said earlier, helps to justify areas of non-action. If asked by the board, or if asked by the audit committee to say, why are you not looking at this area? Why is this area not being funded? Having even if it's a subjective exercise, having a systematic approach to saying this is how we prioritized based on risk and other factors really puts the client in a very solid position in terms of defending where they put their resources. Okay, should we go to the next slide? This is just an illustration, very simplistic illustration of how one might do that prioritization, in this case with just two factors. So you've got value and risk, and it comes from an example of, it actually comes from either an audit or a regulatory compliance example, where you would want, as I said, to focus resources on the areas of greatest importance to the organization and the areas of greatest risk. There may be other things where if it's risky, you don't want to do it. So investment planning, you may not want to pursue high risk areas, but this notion allows us to say, okay, if you take your universe of, let's say, 100 activities and you assess them by value and risk, those that fall in that top quadrant, that top right-hand quadrant, high value, high risk areas, those are the ones that need attention. These are the ones that should be funded. Where low value, low risk, yeah, if I'm an auditor and I'm looking at, or if I'm a regulatory compliance, if I'm a regulator and I'm doing my oversight, yeah, I don't think, if it's low value and low risk, we're not so worried about that. So it just allows for a bit of a funnel of justification of activity there. Okay, next slide. If we can get to the third kind of risk-based solution. And this is something that you may or may not have heard about, but I'm going to go back just before I introduce it to the reality of the client around that, concurrent increase in demand for oversight, but at the same time, pressure to reduce the burden on clients. And this is something that is super relevant for the public sector if you happen to consult in that space, but it's not exclusive to that. We see, if you're familiar with the 3 lines of defense model, where the first line of defense against risk is management. The second line of defense is a whole range of functions within an organization that play some kind of monitoring or oversight role. You would typically find risk management in there. You would typically find compliance, quality management, depends on the industry you're in, but there's a range of kind of assurance functions, monitoring functions that exist to support leadership and accountability and a whole range of other things. That's in the second line of defense. And then of course you've got the third line, which is internal audit. What we're seeing, because there is such demand and there's such scrutiny and there's such fishbowl circumstances, but also increased and very important compliance requirements, we're seeing the second line of defense becoming much more muscular, much more active in their oversight activities and their monitoring. And of course, audit, internal audit and external audit are also active in that space too. And what that's creating is an awful lot of traffic and a lot of oversight burden for organizations, which, sitting as a member of a board again, or as an executive, that takes a lot of time away from the business of the organization. And while it might add value, there are efficient ways to do the oversight of an organization. And the notion of an assurance map helps that. And I could teach a whole course on assurance mapping. It's actually quite a complex methodology, but I'll try to get to the crux of it now. What we want to do with assurance mapping, if you assume we're talking about all of the things that need to be monitored in a given entity, in a given corporation or a given government department or ministry, you would take the universe, which is typically a sort of a universe of business activities that exist, functions that exist and that are performed by the organization. And you identify who's covering what, who's assessing, who's monitoring what part of that organization, and ideally who's monitoring what type of risks. What you want to do with assurance mapping, or what you want to do to optimize oversight, is to figure out who is best placed to do what kind of oversight. Where you would typically, the guiding principle would typically be your most rigorous oversight activities, which according to the 3 lines of defense model is internal audit. You want to put your internal audit, your most robust oversight activities, to your areas of greatest risk. There are other areas in the activities of the organization that might be lower risks that you would be happy to just leave to maybe less robust, less complicated and less costly oversight activities. So in using the oversight map or the assurance map, if you are able to risk rank that universe, then you are able, and especially the board, it's really useful for the board and the audit committee to see, okay, where are all the risks in the organization? And then based on the risks, who do I need to play what role in terms of oversight? So it allows us to say, we've done this in one of my boards. I'm on the board of Atomic Energy of Canada, and we have a lot of oversight in that organization, as you might imagine. But it allows us as the audit committee to say, okay, number one, am I comfortable that the right assurance is being placed in the right area? So which as a board member makes a great, gives me good comfort, or not, if I'm not happy with what I see. And then at a minimum, it tells me where my sources of information exist from an oversight perspective, when I can see who's playing what role. So that really adds value from a corporate oversight perspective, and also can really contribute to efficiency and reduction of oversight burden in terms of the overall organizational regime. So again, I could teach a whole course on that, but I did want to kind of whet your appetite with these three models. Now, I think, if I'm correct in my knowledge, I think the next question is another poll. We're going to wrap shortly with a discussion on success factors and risk factors, but first I want to get your perspectives, if you don't mind. For those of you that are practicing in this space, but those of you that even aren't, and you might have some perspectives, where would you see the biggest barriers among your clients? What do you see those biggest barriers being in terms of adopting these or other risk-based practices into their operations? Are there cultural factors at play you think that would get in the way? Are there factors related to knowledge in terms of understanding good practices? Or is there simply challenges around the value proposition? And that's an interesting spread. Most of you feel, 51%, that there's a lack of perceived value. So people don't really get the value prop of risk management, concern that it adds a burden, but also equally a quarter of you each on the cultural and knowledge factors, which is a nice segue to sort of my last set of slides. One or two slides on key factors for you to consider as you are helping your clients with this. And these are the success factors and risk factors are kind of the flip side of the same coin. As I said, I've been at this for 25 years. I've come in to help organizations establish risk management, and I've come in to help organizations fix risk management when it's gone bad. So these are lessons that I've drawn from many years of scarring and tough knocks. Certainly from a success factor, I think clear purpose, clear expected results, and strong direction, tone at the top as to what you're actually trying to accomplish with this. And that speaks as well to the second factor where making sure it's fit for purpose, making sure it's fit for the organization. Too many clients, and frankly, I think we can all, say this because we're all consultants, too many consultants push cookie cutter stuff, straight out of the box, canned, and sometimes try to sell clients more than they need. And perhaps sell them a model that is too mature for the underlying business processes that exist. Your risk management regime can only be as mature as your underlying business processes and your business culture. So we need it's really important to have a clear sense of what you're trying to accomplish, how sophisticated you need to be, and so on, so that it doesn't die under its own weight, which it often sadly does. Processes need to be efficient, and very importantly, from a success factor, not only do you need the strong demand, right? So the audit committee, senior management, all the tone at the top factors that pull, that are the source of the pull of that risk information. You need a real strong supply. So you need consultants if it's consultant driven, but it can't only be consultant driven. If it's consultant driven only, the organization will suffer, because you really need to institutionalize this in the regular business of the department or the organization. So finding ways to transfer that knowledge, building up a capacity of people that understand what risk is, that have an ability to facilitate and think strategically and systematically around risk is really, really critical. If not, the value proposition is dead, it's gone. So that's really, really important as success factors. And in terms of the risks, again, the flip side to a certain degree, but perhaps a couple of things to comment on there. I do want to underscore, and my next slide actually speaks about the risk aversion, excessive risk aversion. So I started risk management in the government in the late 90s, and my first client was recovering from the sponsorship scandal, as you can imagine. Really at the early days of that, and they refused to have the word risk in their risk assessment. They told me to take it back and take all the word risk out. That's the extreme example of organizations that don't want to. They were trying to do a risk assessment, but they were completely hamstrung by their culture because they'd had so many scars of being seen as problematic in their operations. So that notion of risk aversion and organizational culture is really, really important, and it can really be the death knell of risk management if it's not well sort of managed. And I think that will take me to my next slide. I'm conscious of time because I want to leave time for questions. The notion of culture. So go back to that picture of the gears. So the processes, the framework, the tools, and in the background, everything is swimming in is a culture. People will say there's a thing called risk culture. Yes, I suppose there is, but culture is the culture of the organization, and it's the lens that you put on how an organization deals with risk. But what we want to try to cultivate, and consultants, if you're driving risk management from a consultant-led strategy, you have to make sure you take the organization along with you and find ways. And it's not just through the risk management practices that you need to tap into this. You need to tap in and understand the overall tone at the top from the board and the senior management. Without that, and this is really important, this is a lesson I learned at the Bank of Canada, the governor, just to take an example there, when we built the appetite statement for the bank, the governor used this word license. This is my team's license to take risk. He set the boundaries, he set the guardrails, and in doing so created a real receptive environment for people to talk fearlessly about risk. If you don't have that, there's going to be real barriers to your organization. It also includes ethics and their daily application, accountability, who owns risk. It's not this, when something happens, you need to have and tied into your organizational accountability structures and so on. And lastly, and I would say this really, really importantly as a member of a board, it's critical to corporate governance. We need to foster amongst our clients an encouragement of diverse and contrarian views on risk. So if we're sitting, because I've seen it work both ways. I've been in boardrooms where we got a lot of nodding heads, lots of, yes men and yes women. Yeah, the risk is fine, or the risk is, and no one's bringing that diversity of thought, the challenge function on what about this risk, or I don't agree with that assessment. We need to foster a willingness and a fearlessness, if I can say that, to raise your hand and disclose risk. Or this is where we see in government a lot of the Phoenix scandal. The Phoenix issue was a really good case study of that, of people kind of maybe being afraid of raising the flag when they saw certain challenges happening. And that's one example, and that's just the government. There are many case studies of that in the private sector. The space shuttle blowing up was, again, often used as a case study where there was contrarian views on risk were not there, and you see the consequences of that. So I would leave you with that kind of final word of wisdom, and hopefully we have a little bit of time left. I believe we do. Open it up to any questions or views, contrarian or otherwise.
That's great, Carmen. Thank you so much. I really love your enthusiasm for this topic, and it's it's no wonder that you have some high-level, excellent clients. We've got some really good questions from our audience. One of the ones that I had was, what do you see as the top 3 high areas of risk for most organizations?
Yeah, okay. That's a good question. Again, my perspectives will be probably largely driven by the public sector experience, but I suspect this will be not dissimilar to the private sector. I would say probably number 1, and I would say it's increasingly less a risk than an issue, is cyber. So breaches and bucketed in all of that, all sorts of risk around data, privacy, protection, safeguarding, and so on. So again, I sort of say that with a caveat because frankly, I think cyber risk is not a risk anymore. It's a reality. It's here, and but it is number 1 on everyone's list. It's to state the obvious, although maybe it's less of an issue now, it's more of a transient risk. I would say pandemic issues were obviously key in the last little while. I'm seeing more and more in my clients concern about pandemic response and renewal, and sort of, in some ways, sort of a missed opportunity risk, concern about not really learning our lessons from the pandemic. I wouldn't say that's the biggest, but it's one of the more interesting ones that we're dealing with. I would say maybe two more. I know you asked for top three, but I would say more and more, and this is definitely in the private sector as well as the public sector, risk in relation to stakeholder relations and alignment, making sure that we understand what our stakeholders expect of our organizations, whether they be shareholders, whether they be institutional investors, if you're in the private sector, whether they're the public. The growth of the levels of engagement of organizational stakeholders and the impact that can have on organizations if it's not well responded to throws you off. Look at any issue around pipeline, Indigenous issues, Me Too, all of those factors are out there, and they can take an organization down and have taken organizations and certainly leaders down. And then the other thing I would say certainly is very, very big in the public sector that I see in all my risk profiles is risk around information for decision making. In the context of we're going so quickly, especially in the pandemic, we're making decisions at a speed of light. And lots of increasing data sources available, but the ability to leverage that, utilize it, trust it, there's a lot of risk around how well organizations can do that. So those would be my biggies, I think.
Thank you. That was good. From Cyril, we have, and this is similar to what you mentioned before, but you might want to elaborate on it a bit more. Can risk stem from conditions that are not necessarily the organization business conditions, i.e. the latest, on our infamous coronavirus pandemic?
Can say that again? Can risks?
Well, can risk stem from those conditions?
Absolutely. I think when I think about risk, the sources of risk, there's current conditions in an organization. There are emerging issues within an organization. I see a lot of organizations tell me, let me finish that thought. And there are conditions that exist outside the organization that you may not have any ability to control. But doesn't matter. It's still going to materialize as a risk to you. And I too often I get clients saying, oh, but that's not a risk we can control, so therefore it's not relevant to us. And I kind of shake my head and try to bring them back. The reality is, even if they're external conditions, you need to be aware of them. And even if you can't prevent them, you need to respond to them. So we need to get it on the radar.
Is that kind of like building a crisis management into your risk management?
It's a key part of it, right? Like when we talk about risk mitigation, people will typically think, when they hear mitigation, they think about prevention. But in fact, it might not make sense to prevent your risks. It might, and in some cases you can't. In some cases, the only thing you can do is respond to it. So your risk response, your mitigation, and I see a comment in the chat about cyber. The risk isn't the event anymore, because that's a certainty. The risk is that you won't have a good response plan, and you won't have proper communications around that. So it's a whole spectrum of mitigation measures, including simply responding and doing crisis management in the event that it occurs.
Thank you. Now, from Ralph in Montreal, can you have two types of risks: internal, which can partly be controlled, and then external, generated more from the external world, which cannot be as controlled as much? And what does the client have to learn to adjust to those two different types?
Definitely. Yeah, we didn't talk about the types of risk here. Again, I could teach a whole course on that, but for sure, you typically have in your taxonomy of risk, you've got, you might say, external risks or strategic risks that originate in the external kind of environment that, again, you have no control over, but you have to respond to. And you got a large bucket of risks that are operational: people, processes, technology. And I would also argue and say, depending on how you're using your risk management regime, and this is maybe more a different flavor on the external risks, a lot of my clients are regulators. And so they exist to manage risk, right? So I don't work with Transport Canada anymore because I married someone from Transport Canada, but I know, CFI, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, does the same thing. Environment Canada does the same thing. Their preoccupation is public interest risks. So they're concerned, yeah, they have the corporate side too, where they're looking at people and processes, but they're worried about planes falling out of the sky. They're worried about foodborne illness. They're worried about fraud in food labeling. So those are external risks. They would call them mandate risks or public interest risk, public interest risks that they have to assess and manage as part of their regulatory programs. And, to answer the question, how does the client need to adapt to all of that? They simply need to have, a taxonomy that allows them to kind of make sure they think through all of those different dimensions based on what their objectives are from a risk management perspective.
Right. So obviously, just dividing the internal from the external is a good start. Yeah. And then going through those lists probably in different meetings with probably different groups of people that are going to be involved in those different areas. Yeah. Now here's I think it's a great question. It's a little change of topic, but from Teresa, would the quality or maturity of risk management be significantly related to or dependent on an organization's culture, values, ethics, behaviors, both across the corporation and down the corporation in particular units and or at different geographical locations?
100%.
Yeah, interesting.
100%. So when 100%. The maturity of the organization in terms of its risk management, but also, and I know this wasn't built into the question, but I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about it. But also the tolerance for risk and the philosophy around risk. And I always use the example, I tell stories when I teach, I talk about my kids a lot. Even if you think, I would add another dimension to Teresa's question, even sort of the timeline and the perspective, where you are in the timeline or your maturity as an organization. When I had my daughter, when she was a baby, I was concerned about certain risks around her physical safety. When she was learning to walk, I was worried about her bumping her head or choking on a Cheerio or something. My risk tolerance when she was 1 is very different. It was very different than my risk tolerance now that she's 20. And then you layer on the fact that my husband who had children before, had a completely different tolerance for risk. He didn't care. He saw his kids bumping their heads. They survived. He wasn't worried. So it's the same thing organizationally, that depending on where you sit in the organization, could be geographic, it could be functional, could be hierarchical. It could be, and it is individual risk appetites, risk tolerance, risk kind of preferences are huge factors in affecting the culture of risk and need to be acknowledged and in some cases reconciled. You won't get everyone on the same page ever, but you need to be able to talk about where everyone sits. So yeah, long answer to that one, but
okay. But I think as we deal more and more with organizations in different locations geographically, there's going to be those factors that are going to come in differently. Not to mention the different levels within the corporation, whereas risk in the IT group is viewed completely than the HR group.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, from Rob Shira, what are the most important ESG risk management factors that your clients are struggling with today?
Yeah, great question. So for those of you, I'm sure everyone knows what ESG is, but environmental, social, and governance factors. Huge factor, of course, from a board perspective. Hard to say what the most important factor is, but I would say I think the biggest issue that certainly the boards I'm on we're dealing with is getting ahead and understanding stakeholder interests and stakeholder needs. Because they change a lot, and so it's really finding mechanisms to understand what the expectations of stakeholders are, whether they be environmental stakeholders or social You see increasingly diversity, sort of the EDI and inclusion areas, so that we can get ahead and not get caught flat-footed on what are very, very important ESG factors. So I would say, I don't know if that suffices as a very quick answer, but I think understanding the stakeholder needs and responding to them effectively is a biggie for sure.
It is. Now, one last question here. Once you have a good risk management plan, can you give us a little advice when companies are sitting on it, managers are sitting on it, how we can encourage them to implement that plan?
Yeah, and I guess it depends on what you mean by a plan, but if you're saying kind of a framework that says your commitments in terms of understanding your risk or however it is implemented, I think the biggest piece of advice I would leave you with is, and in part it goes to the design of the plan itself, making sure that that plan is directly related to the business objectives that management is trying to achieve. There needs to be a value proposition. If you're saying you're doing this for compliance purposes, to say you've done a risk assessment once a year, I guarantee you, it will become shelfware instantly. But if you are saying you're doing your risk profile annually, in order to support strategic decision making, and in order to support and to be seen, and it's directly integrated in those business processes to inform resource allocation, it becomes a useful tool. If it's not useful, it will not be used. So the key is making sure that what you're giving them is something that actually makes sense from a business perspective and not just shelfware. All
right, Carmen, thank you. I think Sandra Addison-Brock, our logistics events coordinator, is giving me a hint here about summer coming up. I want to thank you so much for being a guest today. I want to thank Jennifer Smith from Eastern Ontario chapter for suggesting Carmen to our What's Up Wednesday committee for speakers here at CMC Ontario. We will be making a copy of today's presentation as a PDF, and we will distribute it to all registrants, and we will let you know when the YouTube channel has this session videoed and available for your watching at your own convenience. A couple of quick takeaways today for me: risk management is just good management, right? Don't live in the fishbowl. Get ahead of the risks that could undermine your success. Set up a heat map to identify the top priorities. Risk plan is an excellent starting point for strategic or operational plan. And assurance mapping, establish who's responsible for monitoring, okay? And finally, just remember that we will be back with What's Up Wednesday at the end of the summer, September 8th, with a session that will be relevant to all consultants involved in a digital transformation and modernization endeavor. And on October 13th, with Dr. Greg Richards from U of O, discussing analytics-based results management. Enjoy the summer. Be safe, get vaccinated, get your second vaccination, get your parents and kids vaccinated, right? Follow the guidelines as the world opens up, but be respectful and patient, as there will continue to be situations where your leadership will be required. Okay, see you on September 8th at our next What's Up Wednesday session. Go placidly amid the noise and haste. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Carmen.